Welcome to the Implementing CDBG webinar series presented by the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority, also known as CDFA. My name is Ed Geiger, and the topic for this module is reporting and record keeping. You can download a copy of the PowerPoint slides for this webinar from the CDFA website for your reference. Let's get started. There are two general types of reporting that must be completed by CDBG grantees: semi-annual reports to CDFA and labor standards reports. We will discuss both in this webinar. In addition to reviewing the record-keeping requirements when you receive a CDBG grant, this webinar will also cover two important topics related to those records. We will highlight the New Hampshire Right to Know law, which makes records publicly available, and guidance on maintaining confidential records. Starting off, we will review the reporting requirements of CDFA's semi-annual report. CDFA uses its Grants Management System, or GMS, to collect information about the progress of approved projects, including the semi-annual report that must be submitted for all CDBG grants. The information that must be submitted includes both the 6-month reporting period as well as cumulative results and updates for the entire project. When submitting a semi-annual report, you log into the system and identify your project. Grantee contact and organization info are pre-filled in GMS, and you do not need to resubmit that information. Let's walk through the items included in the semi-annual report. A budget status report with the amount of CDBG funds spent and any reimbursable costs incurred must be provided. The project progress section includes a narrative discussion of accomplishments, activities completed, any delays, and time frame for expected completions. Also, information about matching funds and holding the second public hearing on the project are included. That semi-annual report asks you to provide information about program income received by the project, if any. Also, you must report on the number of beneficiaries assisted and income levels, including racial composition and other demographic details for housing and direct benefit activities. Section 3 information is also reported in the semi-annual report, including information on hiring Section 3 residents and contracting with Section 3 firms. In order to determine progress towards Section 3 hiring and contracting goals, information must be provided about the total numbers of new hires, trainees, and contracts awarded. The semi-annual report also collects information on progress with housing units for projects that provide housing assistance. You must report on the units completed by type, rental rehab, owner rehab, or home ownership. For public service projects, report on the number of households or persons assisted as applicable to your project. For public facilities, you must report on the number of households or persons having access to the facility or improvement funded by your CDBG project. Provide an update on contracting with minority and women business enterprises, MBE, WBE. And finally, the semi-annual report gathers information about the remediation of housing units with lead-based paint, including the number of units treated by level of remediation. This slide shows the reporting schedule to use when submitting the GMS semi-annual reports. The due dates are July 15th and January 15th. Moving on to labor standards. There are two reports that grantees are responsible to complete: the Section 5.7 report and the HUD semi-annual report. The Section 5.7 report must be submitted to CDFA when violations of underpayments are either greater than $1,000 or willful violations occur. This report is due after completing an investigation and after final disposition is reached at the local level. The semi-annual labor standards enforcement report is submitted using the HUD Form 4710 and should be sent to CDFA. This report includes a list of all contracts awarded during the period and description of all enforcement activities, including both activities previously described in a Section 5.7 report and any other enforcement activities that did not reach required threshold requiring a Section 5.7 report. The semi-annual report adheres to the reporting schedule shown on this chart. It is not the same time frame as the GMS semi-annual report. Again, labor standard reports are submitted to CDFA, who aggregates and forwards the state's reports to HUD. Now for the remainder of this webinar, we will be covering record-keeping requirements for CDBG. It's critical to have a good record-keeping system. Why? If your staff person leaves, the grantee must still have the records and know how to access them. The records are needed to complete your reports to CDFA, which are gathered and support the reports CDFA submits to HUD. The public or news media may want to or need to access them for a variety of valid reasons. These records must also be available to CDFA staff for the monitoring process. Your records are critical because they are the only way to verify compliance. You can't prove it if you cannot show it. The two most important takeaways about record keeping are, first, the grantee or local government owns the records, not the grant administrator. And funding for the current and all future projects could be in jeopardy if record keeping requirements are not met. As to retention of records, everything from the application through the closeout agreement for the project should be retained. However, the time period is a bit confusing to understand. All records must be retained for 3 years after the date CDFA closes out the applicable program year with HUD. This closeout date with HUD is not the same date as your closeout agreement with CDFA. 3 years beyond the closeout date with HUD could actually extend 5 or more years beyond the end of your project. Check with CDFA if you are not certain about the closeout date with HUD for the applicable program year. Another point to consider is where your records reside. Are they in the backseat of your consultant's car? They should be secured at the grantee or subrecipient's office. Keep files under control and secure during the project. That should always be under the control of your local government. The local government should always have access to the project records. As to security, that includes both electronic and paper versions of files. Self-examination of your filing procedures is an important step for good record keeping. Further, it is a good idea to think about backups of data and records in case of natural or other disasters. Off-site backup, especially of electronic records, is another important consideration in developing good record keeping. Many times, contract grant administrators keep records with them, but remember, the grantee is responsible for the security of those files, so you need to instruct them. This and the next slide list the content of what should be maintained in your record-keeping file. These two slides just highlight the broad category of items that should be retained. There is a more detailed listing of record-keeping requirements in the CDFA implementation guide. We will be drilling down into more detail for those items that are listed with "see below" in parentheses. I will defer the discussion of those items until after these two slides. The application and grant file should maintain your critical submission documents such as the original application submission to CDFA, any threshold documents submitted, and the implementation plan, as well as your grant agreement with CDFA. Citizen participation files should include your plan documents, the Housing and Community Development Plan, and Citizen Participation Plan. This file should have the publisher's affidavit of all public hearing notices and written documentation of all hearings, public comments received, and relevant communication from citizens or local organizations about the project. Fair housing and civil rights files must document the adopted local resolution and fair housing activity that was completed. These files should also include records documenting how contractors were informed and addressed equal employment requirements. Financial records should be maintained that document accounting ledgers, payments to contractors, and audits if applicable to your local government. The contract file refers to contracts procured for professional services and construction work. The executed contracts and related legal commitments, like bid guarantees or performance bonds, must be retained. For reporting, maintain copies of your GMS semi-annual reports. Finally, with monitoring and closeout, retain your CDFA monitoring letter, your response, and the correspondence related to any corrective actions. Also, maintain the closeout certification and closeout agreement. Now we will review the items that should be retained to document national objective by category. For low and moderate benefit, keep records and/or maps showing the boundaries of your service area and document how it is primarily residential. You should have census data showing total persons and the percentage who are low mod income. If you used an LMI income survey, those files should be retained. For low mod limited clientele, document that the activity is solely for a presumed group. For example, a homeless shelter reporting they only provided services to homeless people. If you provided benefit to other beneficiaries, like a child care program, you need to have income verification. The child care program should have provided income verification from families using the center. For low mod housing, you need to retain income verification and source documentation of those households. With low mod job creation and retention, the number of jobs created or retained must be kept. You also must gather the income information of persons benefiting from the jobs created or retained. Projects meeting the slum and blight national objective should retain, if it is an area designation, information to document the geographic boundaries and evidence that slum blight conditions existed, photos, structural surveys, or development plans. For the projects addressing spot blight, you should have evidence of the property conditions, such as code or structural inspections and photos. Finally, when meeting an urgent need, you need to document the threat to health and safety, document the timeline of the incident showing its recent origin, and certify that other financing resources were unavailable, including the inability to borrow funds. All activities require an environmental review process. Maintain the applicable ER form and all written documents supporting that certification. That environmental review form varies based on the category of activities. You will also generally have more than one form to retain. For activities that are categorically excluded, subject to Section 58.5, as well as activities requiring an environmental assessment, the following items should be maintained in the grantee's records. All public notices, as well as the publisher's affidavit for those notices, all studies, maps, and documentation of how the ER decision was reached, including consultation letters, SHPO Section 106 responses, and all public comments received. You should retain the request for release of funds, the HUD form, signed by the certifying officer and submitted to CDFA, and the authority to use grant funds, also a HUD form, showing CDFA's approval to commence activities. Moving on to procurement files, the key documents to retain are summarized on this and the next slide. Again, check the CDFA implementation guide for a full description. The records to be retained include documentation of the cost reasonableness estimates that were completed, copies showing that contractor and subcontractor verifications were checked, all solicitation documents including requests for quotes, RFQ, requests for proposals, RFP, requests for qualifications, RFQ, and invitations for bid, IFB. Document the solicitation for minority and women business enterprises, MBE, WBE participation. Be sure to retain your Section 3 plan. Maintain in your records all responses received from any solicitation, such as quotes, qualifications, proposals, and bids. You should have documentation indicating responses received from MBE, WBE, and Section 3 firms. Finally, your procurement records should include documentation of the justification for selections made, including all scoring documents and bid tabulation sheets, as well as certifications of those tabulation sheets. The next two slides outline the record-keeping requirements for labor standards. Your file should include wage decisions, including any modifications prior to lock-in and the actual lock-in notice, pre-construction conference checklists, signed by all attendees, bid documents, contracts, including notification of contract award, which are also required records for procurement. Keep complete records regarding enforcement, showing underpayments, restitution, and worker affidavits. Other items to retain in the labor standards file are all certified payroll reports and correction reports, all record of employee interview forms, as well as labor standards reports, the semi-annual reports, and the Section 5.7 reports, if any were submitted. Remember, many of the items in these files contain personally identifiable information and must be secured and kept confidential. This slide summarizes the types of documents to be retained for acquisition of real property. Those key documents include all required notices to owners, businesses, and tenants, value documentation, including all appraisals and review appraisals, and fair market value determinations for any voluntary transactions. Maintain all written offers and purchase agreements, and obviously retain deeds and easements secured for the project. This slide summarizes the key items that should be retained related to lower income units replaced under Section 104D. Document the number and nature of replacement units, including those lost, and the characteristics of the replacement units. Maintain records justifying local housing needs are adequately met if replacement units or numbers are smaller than the demolished or converted units. For relocation records, you should maintain a separate file for each household considered for relocation, even if denied. In each file, you should maintain names with income and demographic info, notices to all owners, business owners, and tenants, HUD forms documenting assistance provided to each household. Again, these slides briefly summarize the list of records that should be maintained. The CDFA implementation guide provides more complete detail. Next, one of the topics related to record keeping is the New Hampshire Right to Know law. This law requires that local governments and other public agencies respond to requests for public records within 5 days. Other public agencies include regional planning commissions, intergovernmental agencies, and nonprofits composed of government agencies. Any information created, accepted, or obtained by or on behalf of any public agency in furtherance of its official function is considered a governmental or public record. New Hampshire courts generally assume everything is available to the public unless the governmental agency proves otherwise. You should assume that nearly all of your CDBG records are subject to this law and must be made available to the public if requested, as required by this law. Consult the New Hampshire Attorney General's comprehensive memorandum regarding the Right to Know law. That memo provides guidance on what information can be classified as confidential and exempt from disclosure. Finally, before wrapping up this webinar, we will touch on confidentiality. Grantees must maintain confidential records both in paper format and electronically. These records include staff personnel files, labor and civil rights complaints, and personally identifiable information, including Social Security and financial account numbers. Procedures to restrict access and lock paper files with confidential records should be put in place by the local grantee and a subrecipient or administrator managing CDBG records. Also, there are constantly changing technologies that you must manage in order to secure confidential records. To assist you, the implementation guide includes a guidance document from the U.S. Department of Commerce to help grantees in protecting personally identifiable information stored in electronic formats and computer systems. That concludes our presentation on reporting and record keeping. Should you have any questions, please contact the CDFA Program Manager using the contact information on this slide.